Hi everyone, Nemo here. Welcome back. Today we're looking at an attempt by Kwaku and co. to discredit the CES letter in regards to the Book of Abraham. This is an area where Mormon theology collides with well-known academia, so it should be quite interesting. Let's get to it.
The CES letter makes a number of claims about the Book of Abraham. The majority of them come from a presupposition specifically crafted so the answer must be flawed. This manipulative tactic is very easy to identify. The first claim is that because the Book of Abraham states that it was written by the hand of Abraham, that means the exact papyrus Joseph translated must have been the exact paper Abraham used. Since the papyrus postdates the life of Abraham, the letter insinuates this means the scripture is a fake. This is flawed logic. For example, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is written by J.K. Rowling or C.S. Lewis or some nonsense. However, this book projected was printed in 2006. Yes, she is the author, but not the literal copyist of this book.
That is flawed logic. It's a straw man argument. If the book that you're talking about contained nothing to do with Harry Potter, had none of the work of J.K. Rowling in, and none of the story we would expect, as the papyri contains nothing to do with Abraham, then it would be a fair comparison.
The Book of Abraham as a scripture and story was written by the hand of Abraham. The paper Joseph Smith translated from doesn't have to be, especially since God makes weak things.
It doesn't have to be, but it should contain some of the story that the resultant scripture contains, right?
Strong, and he could literally make Joseph translate a ramen noodle packet and get a new scripture from it.
This is the catalyst argument. Joseph Smith created a document called Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language. This is a clear attempt by Joseph to literally translate the content of the papyri in his possession. In that document, Joseph Smith ascribes entire paragraphs of text to one Egyptian hieroglyph. It's clear that Joseph believed, as evidenced by the Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language text, that he was literally translating the words of Abraham from the papyri, not, as some postulate, a catalyst method, which is a theory that claims Joseph wasn't translating the papyri directly, but they were a source of inspiration. According to this video, a ramen noodle packet would have been acceptable instead of the papyrus, and Joseph still would have got scripture. This sets the listener up to think that the content of the papyri doesn't matter, and as I've shown, they seem to matter a lot to Joseph Smith. There's a link to that Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language document in the description.
I tried that once. They asked me to leave the Walmart. Now, the CES letter quotes a church essay which tells us that certain characters on the fragments discovered in which the Book of Abraham was translated from do not match the words written in the translation. However, the church also makes clear that Joseph Smith claimed no expertise in any language. He readily acknowledged that he was one of the weak things of the world, called to speak words sent from heaven. Speaking
Then why did he attempt a literal translation?
of the translation of the Book of Mormon, the Lord said, "You cannot write that which is sacred, save it be given you from me." The same principle can be applied to the Book of Abraham. The Lord did not require Joseph Smith to have any knowledge of Egyptian. By the gift and power of God, Joseph received knowledge about the life and teachings of Abraham.
This deliberate quote of the church's essay out of context is just the
He was just testifying on a spiritual claim there.
beginning. The letter says, for decades, many thought the papyri were lost in a fire. The original papyrus Joseph translated has since been found. This is not true.
It is. It has been found. It's not inaccurate to say. He's probably going to go on to talk about how it was destroyed in the fire and we only have fragments left. But we have enough to know what sort of document Joseph was translating from thanks to contemporary Egyptology. We know there were funerary texts. Robert Rittner covers this in his 13+ hour conversation with John DeLynn and RFM, which I've linked in the description. I would encourage that you listen to.
The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is the likely culprit of the destruction of the papyri. Only fragments of it survive. The letter is trying to paint a different picture.
No?
The letter makes the case that Egyptologists have translated the source material for the Book of Abraham and found that it matches nothing even related to the book, but rather that it is an Egyptian funerary text. Well, first off,
Well, the church also makes that claim. None of the characters on the papyrus fragments mentioned Abraham's name or any of the events recorded in the Book of Abraham. Mormon and non-Mormon Egyptologists agree that the characters on the fragments do not match the translation given in the Book of Abraham. That's from the church's essay.
the Book of Abraham fragments are not one text as the letter states. The papyri contain excerpts from the Book of the Dead and the Book of Breathings, which are
It also contained a hypocephalus, which unfortunately was destroyed. But again, we know that this forms part of a standard funerary packet.
not the same text. Now, before we tackle the evidence for the Book of Abraham, let's dive into the CES letter's terrible translation of the exact papyri fragments. It criticizes Joseph Smith of falsely translating.
The letter says that the filled-in images inside of the red circles are seen as nonsense by modern Egyptologists. However, we tracked down the person he is quoting, a man named Kevin Matthey.
That's misspelled on the screen just as a point of information. His surname is spelled Mathie in the article, so if you want to go searching for himself, you'll need the correct spelling.
Now, the letter quotes an article by him, but the website is down, so the link redirects back to the CES letter's own website.
Never fear. When you click the link in the CES letter, it does not redirect to the CES website, but to Web Archive, where you can still read Matthey's article, and I've linked it below for you.
So we needed to look up this respected Egyptologist, Kevin Matthey. Turns out he isn't an Egyptologist. He is a composer and pianist, I kid you not.
Can you prove that Kevin Matthey is this piano player? That the author of the article is this piano player you talk about, and the author of the article isn't just some ordinary guy called Kevin Matthey with scholarly interest. Just because you Google Kevin Matthey and found a composer and piano player does not mean that he is the author of the article.
His awards in Egyptology include the Best Behind-the-Scenes Musical Theater MVPs and the 2013 Salt Lake City Artie Awards, which is a wonderful accomplishment, but has literally nothing to do with Abraham or religion. He's a pianist. He's about as credible as me when I played Puss in Boots and Shrek the Musical.
The letter
Kevin Matthey, regardless of who he is, has produced a well-sourced article with footnotes that contain credible sources. Among them is Dr. Robert Rittner, who we spoke about earlier. He is a well-respected and accomplished Egyptologist.
is going to give 3 lists of contradictions between Joseph Smith translations and the modern Egyptologists. But again, the modern Egyptologists the letter is referencing is literally just some guy named Kevin Matthey who has nothing to do with Egyptology. If you read the CES letter, keep that in mind. It isn't a Joseph Smith versus the truth. It's Joseph Smith versus a random guy's opinion. And you have no reason to accept this random guy's translations.
You have no reason to accept this random guy's translations on the face of it, but if you look at the translations as given in this article, what he has done is he's amalgamated external sources of very well-renowned Egyptologists. So you have every reason to believe those people who are experts in their field. Just because someone's done the process of bringing together other sources doesn't mean that because they aren't themselves an expert, they're unreliable. They can bring together the testimony of other experts, and then you can look at those, and it still creates a credible source.
The letter gives a side-by-side comparison of the church's drawn-in version of Facsimile 1 and what the real version is supposed to look like. The only problem is the real version is a modern creation.
It's because it shows what it's supposed to look like, knowing what we know from other Egyptian sources. That's the reason that it's modern. You're painting it out as though it's just as credible as Joseph's idea because it's just made by some modern person. But in reality, this modern person has knowledge of Egyptology. They've put the correct head on the priest for a start, who isn't even a priest. He's the jackal-headed god Anubis.
If it was in fact the correct version as verified by other Egyptian manuscripts, why doesn't the CES letter show those exact Egyptian manuscripts?
We can't show the exact Egyptian manuscripts because they were partially destroyed when they fell in Joseph's lap. That's the reason he drew in the wrong heads in the first place. When Joseph got hold of the papyri, they were already in a fairly worn out state. That's why bits were filled in incorrectly by artists, right? Because papyrus they're fragile things, and when they're rolled and unrolled by a traveling salesman who wants to show them off to various towns that he visits through America, bits fall off, they come into damage.
It's because there's an incredible dishonesty to the idea that the CES letter's facsimile is the end-all be-all. The funerary couch scenes we do have look like this.
So he's just admitted they are funerary texts, so bear that in mind. Also, he's showing several examples of how they look different. They do look different because they were drawn by different artists, but they share very similar themes, and very importantly similar themes. They share, for example, the canoptic jars underneath the couch. They share the lion-headed couch. They share the jackal-headed god Anubis leaning over whoever is on the altar. Not altar, couch. This is the issue, is that they're saying, oh, they don't all look the same, but they share themes which Joseph's text doesn't. Joseph's attempt at recreating it doesn't share very standard Egyptian themes.
And this, and this. If Kevin Matthey is really making the case that Joseph's recreation is off and looks different from the original, why can't he show us the original?
Again, like I said, he can't show us the original because it was partially destroyed when Joseph got it.
The letter claims that the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Book of Abraham have no thematic ties, and that's false. The entire Egyptian Book of the Dead is online free for you to read, and we'll even link it in the description below.
The reason the real Book of the Dead thematically shares characteristics with the Book of Abraham facsimile is because the facsimile is butchered from real Egyptian papyrus. I'm going to keep hammering home this point. It was an authentic papyrus that Joseph got, but it's mingled with incorrect artistic fillings in. So of course parts of it will look thematically like the Book of the Dead, however the content is completely different, because the priest of Pharaoh is actually the jackal-headed god Anubis.
The letter claims the church admits that they have no connection in the Gospel Topics essay. That's a lie. The church claims the literal exact opposite.
One interesting
So you say the church claims the exact opposite and then provide no evidence. Let's quote the church's essay. None of the characters on the papyrus fragments mention Abraham's name or any of the events recorded in the Book of Abraham. Mormon and non-Mormon Egyptologists agree that the characters on the fragments do not match the translation given in the Book of Abraham, though there is not unanimity even among non-Mormon scholars about the proper interpretation of the vignettes in these frames. Scholars have identified the papyrus fragments as part of standard funerary texts that were deposited with mummified bodies. These fragments date to between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, long after Abraham lived.
part of the CES letter is that it constantly cites non-LDS Egyptologists without actually citing these Egyptologists. Only a few are cited.
Hang on. So you said he cites non-LDS Egyptologists like this, and then you're saying he doesn't cite them. And then you go on to say in the next breath, he only a few were cited. Which is it? Did he not cite non-LDS Egyptologists, or did he?
And one is a musical theater director.
No.
Some of the other 3 are Egyptologists who died 2 centuries ago. It's likely that modern Egyptologists wouldn't agree with their work, given they are outdated. Also, these 3 Egyptologists quoted by Jeremy Runnels were literally open white supremacists.
Right, so then we've gone into the ad hominem there. The answer to my previous rhetorical question is that he did cite Egyptologists, right? And you've just mentioned a couple of them, and you've gone ad hominem after their beliefs. He cited Dr. James H. Breasted, Dr. W.M. Flinders Petrie, and Dr. A.H. Stacey. But he also explicitly cites Dr. Robert Rittner by name. He says, world-renowned and respected University of Chicago professor of Egyptology, Dr. Robert Rittner, provided a detailed response and rebuttal to the LDS Church's translation and historicity of the Book of Abraham essay that is sobering and devastating. Dr. Rittner's rebuttal to the Church's essay can be read here. And then he links Dr. Rittner's rebuttal. Is there a reason you're missing Dr. Rittner out?
Hail our people! Hail
That's a February 2021.
victory!
No joke. Archibald Stacey thought African people were midway between white people and apes. James Breasted was a white supremacist who called Mediterraneans barbarians who were holding back society.
And Flinders Petrie was one of the founders of the eugenics movement. I kid you not. The CES letter quotes modern Egyptologists that are either A, not Egyptologists, but award-winning pianists from the Salt Lake City Artie Awards, B, were Egyptologists who died 200 years ago with discredited work,
Or C, people who were basically Nazi.
So beyond your attempt to smear these academics for their personal views, they are non-LDS Egyptologists, which you claimed moments ago that Jeremy didn't cite. And do you have any evidence that modern Egyptologists would agree with them? You didn't bring any of that up. You just went ad hominem on them.
Heil Hitler!
So a musician and 3 Nazis.
Ah, sounds like a weird sitcom.
So you've missed out Dr. Robert Rittner entirely. Is that because he can't be attacked personally? Is that, I don't know. Why is he not included? He's in the CES letter and he's a very credible source.
Here to comment more is Stephen Smoot.
Yes, hello, I am Stephen Smoot, another dude in a gray blazer. The Book of Abraham claims that human sacrifice was practiced in Ur of the Chaldees after the manner of the Egyptians. While many scholars believe Abraham's Ur was in southern Iraq, others believe it was near the border of Turkey and Syria. Evidence shows that this border area saw some influence from Egyptian culture in Abraham's day. It is also now an accepted fact that Egyptians during Abraham's day did in fact practice human sacrifice. During the life of Joseph Smith, this was not an accepted claim. However, Joseph was right. This, in fact, did occur. Much of this new scholarship even has archaeologists moving proposed excavation sites. When I learned the Book of Abraham wasn't taking place in Iraq, I guess you could say Iran.
Dr. Rittner has this to say about the human sacrifice argument. Wherever one locates Ur of the Chaldees, human sacrifice dictated there by priests of Pharaoh is unbelievable to credible scholars of the ancient Near East.
Well, Stephen, there are many correlations between the Book of Abraham and ancient accounts of Abraham not recorded in the Bible, such as
Correlations do not equal causation. Just because some things happen to match up doesn't mean that there is a genuine connection there.
Abraham learning the cosmos in a vision from God, and Abraham being saved by an angel from sacrifice, and
Spiritual
others.
planes.
But do you really have any good correlation between ancient Abrahamic traditions and the Book of Abraham?
Oh, yes. The evidences are, in fact, as endless as Abraham's descendants. See, that's funny, right? Because, God promised Abraham that his descendants would, be as numbered as many as the stars and the grains of the sand, right? The Bible. And the humorous conceit of that joke is, relies upon the fact that...
on with it!
Oh, right. So the Book of Abraham names a number of pagan gods worshipped in Abraham's day. Many people assume Joseph Smith simply made up these names, like the god of Elkanah. However, in the last century, archaeologists have discovered information about the god El-Koneh Haaretz. This god was a Canaanite deity and was worshipped in Turkey and Syria from the time of Abraham all the way down to the time of Christ. In the Book of Abraham, the priest offers 3 virgins on the altar to the god of Elkanah. Little writing about El-Koneh Haaretz remains, but from the little that we do know, a narrative involving sexuality is present in one tablet. So the name of the god is correct, the time period is correct, the location is correct, and even though almost nothing remains regarding the specific myths of this god, a story involving sexuality is hinted at, as you see, for example, in the virgins that were sacrificed with the Book of Abraham.
Hey,
I'll direct you to Dr. Robert Rittner's extensive rebuttal found in the link below. And he said, in reference to Elkanah, whether or not the idolatrous god Elkanah of Abraham 1:17 and facsimile 1 can be conflated with the known Canaanite god El, it is absolutely impossible to identify that god with the Egyptian canoptic jar deity Qebehsenuef, as Smith did in his explanation of facsimile 1, figure 5. I'm going to break from the quote here a moment to explain that. So, what's going on here is that Joseph labeled one of the canoptic jars under the couch as Elkanah, right? Even if that god did exist, he definitely isn't the god of one of those canoptic jars. The god of that particular canoptic jar, well known by Egyptologists, is Qebehsenuef. We know it from Egyptology for a long time. It's in so many other couch scenes he's labeled as Qebehsenuef. So even if Joseph managed to guess the name of an old pagan god right, he put him in the wrong place. And then the quote goes on to say, far too often the LDS approach has been to find individual minor identifications or remote possibilities that cannot in sum either explain or justify the Book of Abraham.
Stephen, can you explain it without putting me to sleep?
Oh, Kwaku, oh heavens, no.
Stephen, one name might be a coincidence. Any others?
Yes, in fact, the Book of Abraham's plain of Olishem has very likely been verified. A place named Ulisum in an inscription from the ancient Akkadian king Naram Sin seems to correlate with this. The city of Ulisum was located somewhere in southern Turkey or northern Syria.
What about Shiny Ha?
Before we get on to Shiny Ha, Olishem and its implications for the veracity of the Book of Abraham have been discussed. I've linked an article to that in the description. But essentially, the point is that if you are going to put Olishem and Olishem together, then you've got to move the traditional location of Ur of the Chaldees, which has been known for a long time. Some argue that that location should be moved, but I would leave you to read that article for yourself.
Yes, Shaneha is attested in the ancient Egyptian pyramid texts and the coffin texts. In these texts, the path of the sun, or the ecliptic, is described as a celestial waterway. This description of the motion of the sun in the ecliptic is interesting because the Book of Abraham names the sun Shaneha, and the ancient names for the sun's ecliptic in these texts is Shiencha in Egyptian. The Book of Abraham
Close, but not the same.
also depicts the sun in a tiered cosmos, which is also consistent with ancient geocentric astronomy from the time of Abraham.
Wait. So you're telling me that if Joseph Smith made up the Book of Abraham, he guessed a pagan god named Elkanah that matches up in name, possible theme, and...
None of these periphery issues override the fact that the church and all modern Egyptologists agree, quote, none of the characters on the papyrus fragments mentioned Abraham's name or any of the events recorded in the Book of Abraham. Dr. Robert Rittner was right when he said that the church looks for these small periphery issues and tries to use them to make a case of the Book of Abraham.
and supposed area of Elkanah Aratz, he correctly guessed that Olishem was a plane that existed. He got the correct name of the sun's path through the sky in the pyramid texts that line up with the description of the cosmos.
He got close to the name.
He was right that ancient Egyptians in Abraham's day performed human sacrifice. He correctly guessed that Abraham was rescued by an angel, that God showed Abraham the pre-existence.
Well, hang on, we've just got into spiritual claims now. Citation needed on those. We've moved away here in a sleight of hand from physical, tangible evidence, which some say may prove credence to the Book of Abraham, to spiritual claims. We have no way of confirming the truthfulness of a claim like that, Egyptology or no.
And that he was taught astronomy in relation to the heavens.
Yes.
Just from that, it sounds like it would be literally impossible for Joseph Smith to have made up the Book of Abraham.
Well, one might say that with certain a priori paradigms assumed at the outset, that one might reasonably affirm such a conclusion.
Certain a priori paradigms such as membership in the LDS Church and the need for the Book of Abraham to be true in order to maintain your worldview. Those sorts of a priori paradigms. LDS Egyptologist Kerry Milstein put it pretty clearly what his a priori paradigms are. He said, I start out with an assumption that the Book of Abraham and the Book of Mormon and anything else that we get from the restored gospel is true. Therefore, any evidence I find, I will try and fit into that paradigm.
Does anyone know what this guy is?
In other words, yes.
Okay. Stephen, people think that because the fragments we have of the papyri don't fully match up with the texts written in the book, that Joseph Smith just made it all up.
Hang on, they don't fully match up. That's misleading. It's been declared by LDS Church themselves, to quote the article again, none of the characters on the papyrus fragments mention Abraham's name or any of the events recorded in the Book of Abraham. They don't match up at all.
Okay, Kwaku, okay, listen up, guys. Here's the thing. Okay, ready? Look. This is God we're talking about here, right? So if you wanted Joseph Smith to translate a ramen noodle packet, it'd be fine. The Book of Abraham would still be true.
There we fall back into the boat of faith and into the God works in mysterious ways argument. Except his ways weren't so mysterious when Joseph was making a document to literally translate the papyrus to try and ascertain what it said and put that into scripture. The grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language makes that quite clear. But ultimately, you can always jump back into the boat of faith. You can always say, well, God made it happen and we don't know why. But if you're going to look at it through any sort of evidential view, then you have to see that the evidence by modern Egyptology is quite damaging to the narrative that the Book of Abraham is what Joseph said it was.
Wait, you've been here the whole time?
I can neither confirm nor deny that I have been sitting 3 feet away from you this whole time.
It is a small budget.
Back to you, Brad and Kwaku.
Right. Sorry that was such a long one, but thank you for sticking through it with me. As always, feel free to subscribe so you see where more of this comes from. Feel free to like this if you liked it. Drop a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know what I could do better. Let me know if there's any additional points you would like to make yourself that I missed. But thank you very much for your support, and we got through this together. See ya.